Hi class, it's Bill Berry with the second video from week 3 of JavaScript, Introduction to Programming with JavaScript. And the first video we covered sort of where we are now, and we got to the things that we're going to cover this week, so I'll skip directly to that. We said that this week we would talk about the basic workflow, which was in that first video, and that we were next going to variables. So I'm going to jump down and we're going to start looking at variables. Variables are something that are a key concept for all programming and all programming languages, and it's something that we desperately want because our scripts are a little bit ridiculous without having this option. So it's going to be something very useful. So let's start talking about variables, and we'll also touch on constants, and I think that'll all make sense. And we'll do some example scripts, of course. So first of all, what is a variable? A variable is a named item. It's a named thing, so we have to give it some sort of, we make up a name for it. It's a named way for us to store values and then use them later. And we have to use one of these, we have to create it using the var keyword, V-A-R. So var says, hey, JavaScript, I want to create a variable, and it will let us do that. We also then need to learn a new operator, and that is the equal sign. And in JavaScript, as in C and Java and many other programming languages, when you see an equal sign, it does not mean equality, which is something we have to get in our head. It's a hard thing at first for beginners, but it does not mean equality. It means assigned. So you think of, I'm going to assign a value to. And then the other little note that we'll see in use here is that you can assign a value to the variable when you create it on the same line, or you can do it on a different line. So let's look at some examples to maybe understand. First of all, down here we have this variable created called username. So this line says, hey, JavaScript, create a variable called username. The second line says, take username, the username variable, and assign to it the value Chris. So notice this is a very typical kind of construction. Variable name equals, and then you give it a value. The way that you read that is, username gets the value Chris, or username is assigned the value Chris. And of course, Chris is a literal, so we put it in quotes. But you can also use numbers, as we'll see. Another thing that you can do, as I mentioned, is you can create the variable and store a value in it on the same line. So you can say var user age equals 29. Now, there are a bunch of rules for naming these things. We'll cover these more in depth later, but you'll notice in general they start with a letter, and then they can contain letters and numbers. A typical way to case these things, this is by convention, it's not that it means something special to the language, but the typical convention for naming variables is you start with a lowercase letter, and then if it's a multi-word concept, you capitalize each letter of the subsequent words. This is called camel casing, right? Because the initial thing is small, and then there can be humps in the middle, and then the end tends to be small letter, lowercase letter as well. So that's camel casing, that's a typical way. The important thing to note is variable names cannot have spaces in them. Again, we'll cover all the rules, but type simple names like the ones you see here and you'll be fine. So that's the basic concept of creating a variable. Now let's go on and talk about how, a couple more concepts, how we can use those. So as I mentioned, you can put any type of data into the variable. You can put a string, you can put a number, you can put a Boolean once we get more into that. So in JavaScript, you don't have to say anything about what type of data is going into the variable. In most other languages like Java and C, languages that are more strongly typed, then we care about that stuff. But here, JavaScript is pretty loose about that stuff, so all we have to do is just throw in whatever we like. Also, to use the contents of a variable, all you have to do is mention its name. And JavaScript will take that variable and it will figure out what is in its contents, and it will retrieve and let you use the contents. So here's an example. I can create a variable called rent due and assign it the value 780. So rent is $780. On the next line, I create another variable called late rent. It's another variable, and I assign it the value of, okay, something new here, rent due plus 35. So when JavaScript sees rent due, it says, aha, I know that's a variable. I'm going to go retrieve its value for you. That's 780. It'll add that to the 35, and now the variable late rent will have 815 in it. So simply using the name of the variable will summon its contents, will be replaced by the contents of the variable, and then you can use it. So again, you can store rent due, and you can use it anytime you need later in the program. That's really useful. Another little detail is that you can create more than one variable at a time. So in the bottom example here, you can say var username equals Pat. So I create a variable called username, assign it the value of Pat, comma, and then I can create a variable called username and assign it to 29. So one var covers multiple variable creation and, if you'd like, assignments as well. So you can create more than one, and you can assign values to more than one all at the same time if you like. So that's important stuff about variables, and that's the basics of how they're going to be used. Now, one other thing that can happen is sometimes you want to create a variable and store a value in it, but you also want to be careful to not change it. For instance, this idea about the $35, rather than hard coding that $35, it might be nice to put that in a variable too. Except we should be careful not to change that, right? It's $35. We don't want to accidentally assign it a different value. We'd like that to be kind of fixed and permanent at $35. So come down here, we'll look at constants. So if you have these values that you don't want to accidentally change, you want to use, instead of the word var, keyword var, you want to use the keyword const. And const says this is a value that should not change. If you try to change it later, JavaScript will slap your hand. It's not going to work, right? It's not going to happen. Now, in terms of naming these things, it is a common convention to put them all in uppercase, because that way when you see them in code, it's quite clear to the eye that it's not the same thing as a variable, and then you'll know that it is a constant. So it would be typical to do something like this: const late underscore rent underscore fee. You'll notice underscores are legal in a variable or constant name. And then I assign it to 35. And then at this point, I can create my rent due variable. I can say late rent equals rent due plus late rent fee. Again, that summons the contents of it. That will be replaced by the 35. That'll be added to rent due. It'll summon the contents of that. That's 780. It's going to have late rent calculated by 780 plus 35, 815 as it was before. So constants are super nice too. Now, of course, if some later day you need to change that constant, you can go and edit the code. It's not that it can never be changed. It's just that while you're running the program, you are not allowed to change it, and JavaScript will come back and it'll refuse to change that anyway if you try. So that's actually a good thing. Okay, so let's look at some typical kinds of questions and some things that might look strange to our eye while we're getting used to this equals, meaning assignment business. So let's start with creating a customer name variable called with the contents Joe, and a customer age variable with the contents 39. So obviously Joe is 39 years old. So let's look at each one of these statements, and be careful because you have to again think about equals, meaning assignment. All right, so if you have any doubt about what's happening, cover up the thing on the left before the equals. So cover that up, or make it let's make it some color that obviously is not going to show, so that you can see. Let's cover this up and let us evaluate what is on the right side of the equals, and then the equals will make more sense. So in this case, I'm going to take cuss name and I'm going to plus, which with strings means concatenate. So I'm going to concatenate onto the customer name a thing called, or a string with space schmo. So what does this do? Well, the result of this is going to be this string concatenated with this string, so it's going to be Joe space schmo. So this expression's result, when we evaluate this expression, the answer is Joe schmo. Now what do we do with that evaluation? Well, let's put the color back over here. Now we assign that to the variable cuss name. So whereas cuss name before had Joe in it, we've now replaced its contents with the result of this expression, Joe Schmo. So what does it have in it? Joe Schmo. Right? That's what's now in that particular variable. Okay, so now let's go and look at the second one. Similarly, again, if it's confusing, cover up the thing on the left and the equal sign, evaluate the thing on the right, and then that gets assigned into the variable on the left. So this looks odd when you see it because it looks like a mathematical impossibility if you think of this as equals, but this is not equals, this is assignment. So it says, take the thing that's in customer age, which is 39 right now, add 1 to it, that makes 40, then assign that back into the variable customer age. So what happens? Joe just got a year older, right? Joe had a birthday, Joe is now 40 years old. So these things look odd, but again, you have to step back and say, I have to understand that these are assignment, not equality, and these make perfect sense. So in essence, this says increment customer age by 1. Okay. Next, let's look at this last example. Take the customer name. That's what now? That's Joe Schmo now. And I'm going to add on the customer age. Well, wait a minute. This is a string and this is a number, so what's going to happen? Well, I'm going to take Joe Schmo and I'm going to add on. When we add to a string, we concatenate. It will coerce the number in customer age to become a string. So at this point, this is going to contain Joe Schmo, Schmo 40. We didn't put any space, so we're going to get Joe Schmo 40. And then what is it doing with that result? It's putting that result of that expression, Joe Schmo 40, into a newly created variable called nameAge. So these things look funny, but it's a good test of our ability to differentiate between equality, which is equals equals, if you want to test something being equal to something else, versus assignment, which uses the equal sign. So those are useful. Pause, go back, consider those, and ask questions in discussion forums or an email if you have them. All right, so now we're going to step forward one more and we're going to look at some full example with variables, and then we're going to look at a small challenge that we'll do together. So here's some examples. See if you can read these. Pause the video, read the whole screen, and see if you can make sense of it all. So what we have at the top, we're creating a customer name variable and putting Dana Duffy in it. A customer phone variable we create and put a phone number in it. We write the customer name and the customer phone to the page. Notice now we don't have to do the prompting or the whatever's in line. We can actually just use the customer name we created above. And then we create a constant called tax rate and put 10% in it. We create a variable called subtotal. We assign that value to it. Then we create a variable called tax. We take the subtotal and multiply it by the tax rate and store it in the variable tax. We create a variable called total. We assign it to the expression, take the subtotal, add in the tax. Then we write them all to the page. So this assigns customer information, figures out, does some calculations with some subtotals and totals and taxes, and then it prints them all out to the screen. Hopefully that all makes sense. So now that we have variables, it's a lot easier to write these things because we don't have to keep duplicating our data all over the place. So here's our quick challenge. We're going to start with that code, but now instead of the customer name and the phone and the subtotal, instead we want to prompt for that information. So I'm going to go and cheat and take all this code from here and copy it. And now let's go do a variable example. So let me now minimize this for a minute, and I'm going to have customer, let's do the invoice. I guess we'll just call it invoice HTML. Per my usual workflow, I'm going to open that in Notepad, and I'm going to also open it in the browser. I'm going to move that to the right and allow the content, and I'm going to move this to the left so I have them next to each other. Now I'm going to take all this stuff out and I'm going to replace it with my script. I'm going to highlight this all. Here's a great trick. Highlight it, tab, 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 so that I get that tabbed in right. Okay, now my goal is everything works fine. I'm going to refresh the script. I'm going to save it over here in the left, and I'm going to refresh it over here in the right. Everything looks great. Let me zoom in a little for you. So everything looks pretty good, although I probably want a space right here after the phone number. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to go save it and verify that that change worked. Again, the normal workflow. Now, instead of hard coding the name, I want a prompt for it. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to break these over 2 lines for the moment. And then instead of just saying equals Dana Duffy, what can I set it to? I'm going to set it equal to a prompt and say, what is the customer name? Or just for the moment, customer name. And I always put a default. I don't know a good default, so I'm just going to hit that. So now, instead of assuming the name, I'm going to prompt for the name. Does that make sense? Now, instead of the phone being hard-coded again, I'm going to prompt for that information. So prompt, and I'm going to say customer phone. And then, again, I don't know how to make a default, so I'm just going to say that. Now, I also want to ask one more question, and that is for the subtotal, right? So I'm going to ask for that. So instead of assuming it down here, I'm going to ask that question. And in fact, maybe I'm going to move this up and put it here because I think this is a better place for it. And I'm going to, again, prompt for that. So I'm going to say prompt and customer invoice or subtotal. Okay, invoice subtotal. Right? And I'm going to, again, I can't really assume something. Now, the one problem with this is it may work okay, because remember JavaScript will bend over backwards to try hard to make things work for you. But to make absolutely sure, I'm probably going to convert this to a number. And again, I'm going to put parentheses here at the beginning and parentheses at the end. You'll notice that even Notepad is smart enough to say, hey, that's the matching one. So I'm prompting for the invoice subtotal, and then I'm turning it into a number. Right? That should make sense based on what we've talked about in class. Now, another thing, stop and look at that, and that's fine. But I want to show you another thing, that now we have the idea of variables. We can also do that in 2 steps. Subtotal equals number subtotal. All right, let's be careful in writing subtotal the right way the whole time. Okay, now, because we have variables, we can say, hey, I'm creating a variable called subtotal and setting it equal to the prompt that follows. That'll prompt the user, and we'll type that in. Now we've stored it in subtotal, but we want to convert it to a number. So call the number function, pass it the subtotal. It's going to turn this into a number, or attempt to do so, and it's going to store it back in subtotal. So now we can break all of these things into multiple steps if we'd like, and that should work just fine. Subtotal is going to be a number, then we can move on and assign our tax rate and do our calculations, etc. I'm going to save that. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to run it. Customer name, Pat Smith. Customer phone number, 206-555-1212. Customer invoice, $132.24. Okay. Now we have all of our stuff just exactly right. Now, we don't like the rounding. Yes, we'll come back to that another day. But at least for now, we have done the challenge. We've accomplished the mission here. We've replaced all the hard-coded names with prompts, and all we needed is to store them in variables, and then we could use them at our leisure. Hopefully that makes sense to you. It makes our programs a little longer in some ways, but it makes each line less dense. And again, go back and look at this. You have 2 options here. Remember, you can do them together like this, or I'm going to copy them and paste them. I'm going to comment out these 2 lines so we can leave them in there for you to see. And remember that you can always do these things together. So instead of doing it here, I can call the number, I can do the prompt, I can put the parentheses at the end to match them up, and then remove them. So you can always do it in 1 step if you like, but now that we have variables, you can also do it in 2 steps, which can make life a little bit easier. Either way, it's going to work just fine. Again, we're going to come over here. If you have problems, remember, F12, bring up your console, run your script again, customer name Joe Schmo, customer phone, blah, 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 and customer total 99. Okay. Notice no other messages came out. It didn't have any errors or anything. There was a warning, but that doesn't matter. So it's not a bad idea to do. So let's go back to our slides just for a quick moment. So we have now covered the basic concept of variables, and we have taken the challenge and done exactly what it requested. We have a lot more interesting things still to cover. We will go next to looking at some documentation, internal documentation for our code, but this video is getting it long enough, so let's stop it here. And since we'll see each other in class, you can ask questions then or on the forums or in email. Thanks for watching.